The summer before my final year of college was supposed to be uneventful. Days filled with lazy afternoons and weekends hanging out with my best friend, Jake, at his family's sprawling countryside home. Jake and I had been inseparable since high school, a bond forged over shared classes, late-night gaming marathons, and countless inside jokes. His family always welcomed me as one of their own, though his father, Mr. Harrison, stood apart, polite but distant, a man who exuded quiet authority. Jake's family had a certain air of sophistication. His mother, a gracious woman with a flair for hosting, balanced the household with warmth. Mr. Harrison, on the other hand, was a different story. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved through their home with the confidence of someone used to being in control. He was a corporate lawyer, sharp, intimidating, yet undeniably magnetic. The first time I met him, I was struck by how little he seemed like other dads. He didn't crack jokes or ask about school like most parents did. Instead, he greeted me with a firm handshake and a brief nod, his sharp blue eyes scanning me as if I were a case he was sizing up. Jake would tease me later, saying, "Don't worry, he's like that with everyone. Dad's just intense." It was during one of these summer weekends that everything began to change. Jake had invited me over for the weekend, a chance to escape the monotony of my apartment and enjoy a few days of relaxation. The Harrisons' home was a sprawling estate, complete with a tennis court, a pool, and a picturesque garden. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where the outside world felt like a distant memory. The first evening, we lounged in the den, Jake flipping through channels while his parents entertained guests upstairs. The faint hum of conversation and clinking glasses drifted down, a reminder of the world beyond our bubble. When Mr. Harrison entered the room to check on us, I felt the atmosphere shift. "Everything okay down here?" he asked, his voice deep and measured. "Yeah, Dad. Just figuring out what to watch," Jake replied without looking up. Mr. Harrison's gaze lingered on me for a moment longer than expected. "Make yourself at home," he said before retreating upstairs. That fleeting interaction should have meant nothing, but it stayed with me. There was something about the way he carried himself, an unspoken confidence that drew people in. The next morning, Jake was called away unexpectedly. His younger sister had car trouble an hour away, and their mom insisted he go help. "I'll be back by afternoon," Jake had said, grabbing his keys. "Just hang out. Dad's around if you need anything." After Jake left, the house felt emptier, the usual hum of activity replaced by a heavy stillness. I wandered into the kitchen, unsure of what to do with myself. Mr. Harrison was there, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Morning," he said, glancing up briefly. "Morning," I replied, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. "You drink coffee?" he asked, holding up the pot. "Sometimes," I said, hesitating. He poured me a cup without waiting for a definitive answer, and gestured for me to sit at the kitchen island. We sat in silence for a moment, the rich aroma of coffee filling the air. It was the first time I'd been alone with him, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being under a microscope. "So, what are your plans after college?" he asked, breaking the silence. "I'm still figuring that out," I admitted. "Maybe law school. I'm not sure yet." He raised an eyebrow. "Law school, huh? It's a demanding path, but it can be rewarding if you're passionate about it." I nodded, unsure of what to say. His words carried weight, as though he spoke from a place of hard-earned wisdom. The conversation continued, unexpectedly fluid and engaging. He asked about my interests, my family, and my goals, listening intently to my answers. His usual aloof demeanor softened, replaced by something warmer, almost fatherly. Yet beneath it all, there was a tension I couldn't quite place. At one point, he leaned back in his chair, studying me with a look that felt both curious and disarming. "You're a smart kid," he said. "Jake's lucky to have a friend like you." I laughed nervously, unsure how to respond. "He's been a great friend to me, too." As the morning wore on, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, and I found myself relaxing in his presence. He had a way of making you feel like the center of attention, his sharp focus both flattering and unnerving. Later, as I wandered into the garden to clear my head, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It wasn't just the novelty of having a deep conversation with Mr. Harrison. It was the way he had looked at me, intense, searching, as if he saw something in me that I didn't fully understand myself. By the time Jake returned, the house felt different. The easy camaraderie I'd always shared with him now carried an undercurrent of unease. I told myself I was imagining things, that the morning's interaction had been nothing more than an innocent conversation. But deep down, I knew better. Something unspoken had passed between Mr. Harrison and me, something I couldn't ignore. As we sat down for dinner that evening, I found myself hyper-aware of his presence at the head of the table. His every glance, every word seemed charged with meaning, even if I couldn't decipher it. By the time I went to bed that night, my mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. The lines between admiration, respect, and something else entirely had begun to blur, and I wasn't sure what to make of it. Lying there in the dark, I couldn't help but wonder, had I imagined it all? Or had something truly shifted between us? The answer, I feared, would come sooner than I was ready for. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight streaming through the windows of the guest room. I stretched, the events of the previous day lingering in my mind like a shadow. Jake had already texted, letting me know he'd be out most of the morning helping his sister with errands. It would just be Mr. Harrison and me in the house again. I told myself it was nothing. After all, yesterday had been normal, almost too normal. If there had been any tension in our conversation, it had been my imagination. Yet, as I made my way downstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different. I found Mr. Harrison in the den, seated on the leather couch with a book in his lap. He looked up when I entered, his piercing blue eyes meeting mine. "Morning," he said, his voice steady. "Morning," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Jake's still out." I nodded. He said he'll be back later. He gestured to the armchair across from him. "Have a seat." I hesitated, but only for a moment. His tone was friendly enough, and I didn't want to seem rude. I sat down, the soft leather creaking under me. For a while, we sat in silence. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of pages as he turned them and the distant hum of the air conditioning. I tried to focus on the framed photographs on the mantel. Pictures of the Harrison family smiling at graduations and vacations. But I was acutely aware of his presence. "You seem quieter than usual," he said, breaking the silence. I glanced at him, caught off guard. "Just tired, I guess." He closed his book and leaned back, studying me. "Something on your mind?" "No," I lied, forcing a smile. "Why do you ask?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he rested his elbow on the armrest, his hand brushing against his chin as if considering his next words carefully. "You're different from most of Jake's friends," he said finally. "More thoughtful. You don't just speak to fill the silence." The comment caught me off guard. Thanks, I guess?" He chuckled, a low, warm sound that sent a strange chill down my spine. "It's a compliment," he said. "Not many people appreciate the value of silence." There was a pause, heavy and charged. I didn't know what to say, so I looked away, my gaze falling to the rug beneath my feet. "You're a good kid," he continued, his tone softer now. "Jake's lucky to have you around." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. Something about the way he said it felt different. Not quite fatherly, not quite friendly. It was subtle, but it was there, a thread of something unspoken, something dangerous. "Thanks," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, the air between us seemed to hum with unacknowledged tension. I could feel his eyes on me, and despite myself, I felt my face grow warm. I wanted to leave, to find an excuse to escape this suddenly too small room, but my legs refused to move. "I'm sorry if I'm making you uncomfortable," he said suddenly, his voice low. I blinked, startled. "What? No, you're not." "You're a terrible liar," he said with a faint smile. I laughed nervously, my heart pounding, I'm fine, really. He stood then, crossing the room in a few easy strides. For a moment, I thought he was going to leave, but instead, he stopped just a few feet away, his presence commanding. Sometimes, he said, his voice almost a murmur, we find ourselves in situations we don't quite understand. But that doesn't make them any less real. I didn't know how to respond. The room felt impossibly still, the air thick with something I couldn't name. He took a step closer, and I felt my breath catch. You don't have to say anything, he said, his gaze steady. But I think you know what I mean. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat. I knew I should say something, anything, but my mind was a blur of conflicting thoughts and emotions. Before I could react, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt through me. I looked up at him, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before: vulnerability. It was that vulnerability, that crack in his otherwise unshakable demeanor, that undid me. Without thinking, I leaned into the moment, the space between us evaporating. The kiss was brief, but electric, a flash of something forbidden and undeniable. When it ended, we both pulled back, stunned. I started, but he shook his head, silencing me. This was a mistake, he said, his voice thick with regret. I nodded, my cheeks burning. Yeah, a mistake. Neither of us moved, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on us like a physical force. Finally, he stepped back, his expression unreadable. We should forget this ever happened, he said. Yeah, I said again, my voice hollow. Forget it? But as I left the room, my heart still racing, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. The hours that followed were a blur. By the time Jake returned, the house felt like a stage set for a play in which I didn't know my role. Every glance, every word from Mr. Harrison seemed loaded with meaning, even if no one else could see it. Jake, oblivious as ever, flopped onto the couch beside me and launched into a story about his sister's car troubles. I nodded at all the right moments, but my mind was elsewhere. The weight of the kiss lingered like an invisible mark, seared into my consciousness. I replayed it in my mind, the closeness, the heat, the impossible lines we'd crossed. Each time, it felt more surreal, like something that couldn't have possibly happened. But it had. That evening at dinner, the tension in the air was unbearable. Mr. Harrison sat at the head of the table, his usual place of authority. His expression was calm, composed, as though nothing had happened. But I couldn't look at him without feeling my pulse quicken, my shame deepen. You're quiet tonight, Jake said, nudging me with his elbow. Just tired, I replied, forcing a smile. Across the table, Mr. Harrison's gaze flicked to me for the briefest moment. It was almost imperceptible, but I caught it. That look said more than words ever could. It was a silent acknowledgement of what we both knew but couldn't say. After dinner, I excused myself early, retreating to the guest room under the guise of needing rest. Once alone, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. My thoughts raced, a chaotic mix of guilt, confusion, and something I didn't want to name. I hadn't just betrayed Jake. I betrayed myself. The bond between us, once unshakable, now felt fragile, like it could shatter under the weight of my secret. A soft knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. My stomach dropped. Yeah? I called, trying to sound casual. The door opened a crack, and Mr. Harrison stepped inside. He closed it behind him, his movements deliberate but quiet. We need to talk, he said, his voice low. I stood, my heart pounding. Mr. Harrison, Please, he interrupted, raising a hand. Just listen. I crossed my arms, more to steady myself than anything else. Okay. He took a step closer, keeping his distance but ensuring we were eye to eye. What happened earlier, it shouldn't have. I shouldn't have let it happen. I swallowed hard. I shouldn't have either. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. For the first time, he looked less composed, less in control. "You're a good person, and I don't want you carrying this burden alone. This was my fault." His words felt both like a relief and a punch to the gut. "It's not just your fault," I said quietly. "I was there too." He nodded, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "Regardless, we can't undo it, but we can make sure it never happens again." I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "What do we do now?" "We move on," he said firmly. "You'll leave tomorrow with Jake, and this will stay between us. No one else needs to know." His tone left no room for argument, but the weight of his words settled heavily on my chest. Could I really just bury this and pretend it never happened? "Okay," I whispered. He lingered for a moment longer, as if he wanted to say more, but then he turned and left, the door clicking softly shut behind him. The drive back with Jake the next day was agonizing. He chatted away, oblivious to the storm inside me. I nodded, laughed when appropriate, and pretended everything was fine. But the truth sat heavy in my chest, a secret that threatened to consume me. By the time I got home, I was exhausted, not from the trip, but from the emotional toll of the weekend. I collapsed onto my bed, staring at the ceiling as the memories played on a loop in my mind. The guilt was suffocating. I had crossed a line I never should have, and now I had to live with the consequences. But alongside the guilt was something even more troubling, a lingering sense of connection. I couldn't deny that something had shifted in me. Mr. Harrison had seen me in a way no one else ever had. In that moment, I hadn't felt like a kid fumbling his way through life. I'd felt noticed, valued, even desired. But at what cost? The days turned into weeks, and life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Jake and I hung out like we always did, and I avoided any mention of his family. I told myself I could move on, that I could bury the past and let it fade into memory. But late at night, when the world was quiet and I was alone with my thoughts, the guilt and longing crept back in. The kiss had left a mark, not just on my lips but on my soul. Months later, Jake mentioned his family in passing. "Dad's been asking about you," he said casually. I froze. What did he say? Just that he hasn't seen you in a while. "You should come by again sometime." The thought made my chest tighten. I mumbled something non-committal, changing the subject as quickly as I could. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about what might have been. If things had been different, if that moment hadn't happened, maybe I could have gone back to Jake's house without the weight of a secret between us. But things weren't different. They never would be. And so, I carried the secret alone, a reminder of the line I'd crossed and the bond I'd broken. It was a story that would never be told, a truth buried beneath the surface of my friendship with Jake and the quiet life of Mr. Harrison. Some secrets I realized are best left unspoken. The end.